On February 27, 1900, after 10 days of relentless bombardment, starvation, and some of the most savage fighting of the entire war, General Piet Cronjé and 4,000 Boer fighters surrendered to British forces on the banks of the Majuba River at a place called Paardeberg. It was the anniversary of the humiliating British defeat at Majuba Hill 19 years earlier, a date thick with symbolism that made the surrender all the more bitter for the Boers. Cronjé, the hero of Magersfontein, who had inflicted one of Britain's worst defeats just months before, was now a prisoner, along with an entire commando force that represented a significant portion of the Boer military strength. The fall of Paardeberg was more than just a tactical victory. It was the moment when Boer confidence in their ability to win the war shattered, when the realization set in that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome the Empire's inexhaustible resources. This is the story of how a stubborn general's refusal to adapt, combined with British persistence and overwhelming firepower, turned what should have been a fighting retreat into a trap from which there was no escape, and how that trap broke not just an army but the spirit of an entire cause. To understand how Cronjé's force ended up besieged at Paardeberg, we must examine the dramatic shift in British fortunes that occurred in early 1900. Just weeks earlier, the war had seemed on the verge of becoming an imperial catastrophe. Black weeks, disasters, the ongoing sieges of Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking, and the repeated failures to break through Boer defensive lines had created a crisis of confidence in London. The British government responded by sending Lord Roberts, one of the Empire's most celebrated commanders, to take personal command in South Africa, with Lord Kitchener as his chief of staff. Roberts brought not just his reputation but a fundamentally different approach to the campaign. Where his predecessors had battered themselves bloody against Boer defensive positions in frontal assaults, Roberts planned to use Britain's overwhelming numerical superiority for deep flanking maneuvers that would threaten Boer lines of retreat and force them to abandon their prepared positions. It was sound strategy that exploited British advantages while avoiding their demonstrated weakness in frontal attacks against entrenched defenders. Roberts' first major objective was the relief of Kimberley, the diamond mining centre that had been under siege since the war's opening. Rather than attacking the Boer siege lines directly, Roberts assembled a massive force and marched it in a wide arc to the east, bypassing the main Boer defensive positions along the Majuba River. General John French's cavalry division led this flanking movement, racing northward with over 5,000 mounted troops. The maneuver worked brilliantly. French's cavalry broke through to Kimberley on February 15th, lifting the siege and forcing the Boers to abandon their carefully prepared defensive lines. This is where Piet Cronjé made the fatal decisions that would doom his command. Cronjé had been defending the positions around Magersfontein, the scene of his greatest triumph, with a force of approximately 5,000 fighters, when Roberts' flanking movement threatened to cut him off from the Transvaal. Cronjé had two realistic options. He could abandon his heavy equipment and supply wagons to make a rapid retreat with his mobile commandos, or he could have retreated earlier before the British trap could close. Cronjé chose neither option. Instead, Cronjé attempted a conventional military withdrawal, taking with him an enormous wagon train containing supplies, ammunition, and the personal possessions of his fighters and their families. This was understandable from a humanitarian perspective. Many Boer commandos travelled with their families, and abandoning the wagons meant abandoning women and children to an uncertain fate. But from a military perspective, it was catastrophic. The wagon train, stretching for miles and moving at walking pace, transformed a mobile commando force into a slow-moving column that British forces could easily track and intercept. Roberts immediately recognized the opportunity. He ordered every available unit to pursue Cronjé's retreating column, with the objective of catching and destroying it before it could reach the safety of Bloemfontein or link up with other Boer forces. British infantry divisions force-marched across the veldt in pursuit, while French cavalry raced to get ahead of the Boer column and block its line of retreat. It was a pursuit on a scale unprecedented in the war, with tens of thousands of British troops converging on a single Boer force that was slowed to a crawl by its logistical tail. Cronjé's column made agonizingly slow progress. The wagons broke down, animals collapsed from exhaustion, and the dust raised by thousands of oxen and horses marked the column's position for any observer. British cavalry began harassing the flanks and rear of the column, forcing Cronjé to detail fighters to drive them off, further slowing the retreat. By February 17th, it was clear that the British were going to catch the column before it could reach safety. Cronjé made his stand at Paardeberg Drift, a crossing point on the Modder River about 20 miles east of the abandoned Majuba positions. It was not a position he chose for its defensive advantages, but simply where his exhausted column was when the British caught up in force. The location had some natural benefits. The riverbanks provided cover, and the brush along the waterway offered concealment. But it was also a trap. The river meandered through relatively flat, open country where British artillery could dominate the surrounding terrain. There were no commanding heights for the Boers to occupy, no natural fortress to defend. It was simply a river crossing where Cronjé's column happened to be when it could retreat no further. Cronjé ordered his fighters to dig in along the riverbanks, creating trenches and defensive positions in the sandy soil. The Boers were expert at this kind of field fortification, and within hours they had constructed a defensive perimeter roughly 2 miles long following the curves of the river. The supply wagons were parked in laagers within this perimeter, presenting massive targets but impossible to move without abandoning the position entirely. Women and children sheltered in the wagons or in caves dug into the riverbanks. The Boers prepared for a defensive stand, but this was fundamentally different from their earlier battles. At Majuba they had chosen the ground, prepared elaborate defenses, and fought from positions of strength. At Paardeberg they were trapped, with limited supplies, no realistic hope of relief, and British forces converging from all directions. The British forces arriving at Paardeberg on February 17th and 18th represented an overwhelming concentration of power. Lord Kitchener, in tactical command, while Roberts was briefly incapacitated by illness, had over 20,000 troops and substantial artillery. The Boers were outnumbered more than 4 to 1, surrounded on 3 sides, with the river blocking the 4th direction. From a conventional military perspective, Cronjé's position was hopeless. Surrender would have been the logical choice, preserving his force for future operations. But Cronjé was a stubborn, proud man who had defeated the British spectacularly at Majuba. He believed his fighters could hold the position until relief arrived or until darkness allowed a breakout. Kitchener, aggressive and impatient, decided on an immediate assault. Rather than simply surrounding the position and bombarding it into submission, he ordered a direct infantry attack on February 18th. This was exactly the kind of frontal assault that had led to disasters earlier in the war, and it produced similar results. British infantry advanced across open ground toward the Boer trenches along the river, and the Boers, fighting from cover with their usual marksmanship, cut them down in swathes. Wave after wave of British soldiers charged toward the riverbank, only to be stopped by devastating rifle fire. The fighting on February 18th was brutal and costly. British units reached to Boer trenches in some sectors, leading to desperate hand-to-hand combat in confined spaces. The Canadians, fighting their first major engagement of the war, advanced to within 100 yards of the Boer positions and held ground under murderous fire throughout the day. The Highlanders, hoping to redeem their reputation after Magersfontein, threw themselves at the Boer defences with suicidal courage. But courage was not enough. By nightfall, the British had suffered nearly 1,200 casualties and had accomplished nothing beyond, demonstrating that frontal assaults were still suicidal against entrenched Boers. Lord Roberts, recovering from his illness, arrived at Paardeberg on February 19th and immediately countermanded Kitchener's aggressive tactics. Roberts recognized that there was no need to sacrifice more soldiers in futile assaults. The Boers were surrounded, their supplies were limited, and time was on the British side. Roberts ordered a formal siege, surrounding Cronjé's position with trenches and bringing up every available artillery piece to bombard the Boer laager systematically. What followed was 10 days of methodical destruction. British artillery, positioned on the heights surrounding the river valley, poured shells into the Boer positions with devastating accuracy. The Boers had nowhere to hide. The trenches along the riverbank provided some protection from rifle fire, but were vulnerable to plunging artillery shells. The supply wagons, parked in laagers, were systematically destroyed. Horses and oxen were killed by the hundreds, their carcasses rotting in the heat and adding disease to the torments of bombardment. The conditions inside the Boer perimeter deteriorated rapidly. Water was available from the river, but it became contaminated with blood and decomposing animal carcasses. Food supplies ran low, then ran out entirely. The constant artillery bombardment made sleep impossible and shredded nerves. Wounded men suffered in makeshift hospitals dug into the riverbanks, with limited medical supplies and no way to evacuate serious cases. Women and children huddled in the wagons or caves, terrified by the endless explosions and the gradual disintegration of their world. The psychological impact of the siege was profound. The Boers at Paardeberg had been confident fighters, veterans of successful battles against the British. Now they were helpless targets, unable to fight back effectively against artillery they couldn't even see. The sense of abandonment grew as days passed with no sign of relief. Other Boer commandos were in the area, and Christian Duet attempted a relief operation, attacking the British siege lines in an effort to break through to Cronjé's force. But Duet's attacks were repulsed, and it became clear that no relief was coming. Cronjé's stubborn refusal to consider surrender as the situation deteriorated became increasingly controversial among his own men. By the standards of military honor, there was no shame in surrendering when further resistance was hopeless. The Boers had fought courageously, inflicted significant casualties on the British, and endured conditions that would have broken many professional armies. Continuing to hold out was simply extending the suffering of the wounded and the women and children trapped in the perimeter. But Cronjé was a man of the old school, believing that surrender was disgraceful and that his duty was to hold out until relief arrived or until his force was completely destroyed. The British siege lines gradually tightened around the Boer position. British infantry dug approach trenches, moving closer to the Boer perimeter under cover of darkness. Sharpshooters targeted any Boer who showed himself above the trench line. The artillery bombardment continued without pause, thousands of shells falling on an area just 2 miles across. The volume of fire was unprecedented in the Boer War. British gunners were determined to demonstrate that no position, however well defended, could withstand modern artillery employed in overwhelming quantities. By February 26th, the situation inside the Boer perimeter had become unsustainable. Ammunition was running low, though still sufficient for defense. Food was almost completely exhausted, with men surviving on scraps and whatever could be scavenged from dead animals. The stench of decomposition was overwhelming, and disease was beginning to spread through the crowded trenches. Wounded men were dying from lack of medical care. The civilian families trapped in the perimeter were suffering terribly, with children crying constantly from hunger and fear. That evening, under cover of darkness, Cronjé finally sent a message to Roberts requesting terms for surrender. The negotiations were brief. Roberts demanded unconditional surrender, and Cronjé, with no bargaining position, accepted. The formal surrender took place on February 27th, the anniversary of Majuba, adding symbolic weight to the British victory. Cronjé and approximately 4,000 Boers laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. It was the largest single capture of Boer forces in the entire conflict. The scene when British troops entered the Boer perimeter was one of utter devastation. The laagers were scenes of carnage, with hundreds of dead animals and wrecked wagons. The trenches were littered with dead and wounded Boers who had endured 10 days of continuous bombardment. The civilian families emerged from their shelters in a state of shock and exhaustion. British soldiers, even those who had fought bitterly against the Boers for months, were moved by the suffering they witnessed. The treatment of the surrendered Boers was generally correct, if not generous. Cronjé himself was photographed with British officers, images that would be distributed worldwide as proof of British victory. The captured fighters were processed and sent to prisoner of war camps, first in South Africa and later in places as distant as Ceylon and St. Helena. The civilian families were separated from the fighters and eventually placed in concentration camps, beginning a policy that would lead to enormous suffering and controversy. The impact of Paardeberg on Boer morale was catastrophic. Cronjé had been a symbol of Boer military success, the victor of Magersfontein, who had inflicted one of Britain's most humiliating defeats. His surrender, with an entire commando force, demonstrated that even the most successful Boer commanders could be defeated when the British employed their numerical superiority intelligently. The loss of 4,000 fighters, representing perhaps 10% of total Boer military strength, was a blow the republics could not easily absorb. More fundamentally, Paardeberg shattered the strategic assumptions on which Boer resistance had been based. The Boers had believed that by inflicting costly defeats on the British, by making the war expensive and frustrating, they could force a negotiated settlement that would preserve their independence. Paardeberg demonstrated that Britain was willing to commit whatever resources were necessary to win, and that British commanders were learning from their earlier mistakes. The methodical siege that destroyed Cronjé's force showed that the British no longer needed to launch suicidal frontal assaults. They could simply surround Boer positions and destroy them with artillery, accepting the slower pace in exchange for minimized British casualties. The fall of Paardeberg opened the road to Bloemfontein, which Roberts captured just 2 weeks later. The relief of Ladysmith came within days of Cronjé's surrender. By mid-March 1900, all 3 besieged towns had been relieved, and British forces were advancing on all fronts. The conventional phase of the war seemed to be ending in British victory. Many Boers, demoralized by the loss of Paardeberg and the subsequent British advances, simply went home, convinced that further resistance was hopeless. But Paardeberg also marked the beginning of the war's transformation into a brutal guerrilla conflict. Leaders like Christian de Wet and Jan Smuts recognized that conventional defensive warfare was no longer viable against British numbers and firepower. The lesson of Paardeberg was clear. The Boers could not afford to be pinned down in fixed positions where British artillery could destroy them. The future of Boer resistance lay in mobility, in guerrilla tactics, in raids on British supply lines rather than defense of territory. This realization would prolong the war for more than 2 years beyond Paardeberg, but it also meant abandoning any hope of military victory in favor of making British occupation so costly that political will to continue the war would collapse. The British victory at Paardeberg was celebrated throughout the Empire as a turning point, proof that the disasters of Black Week had been overcome and that British arms would ultimately prevail. Lord Roberts was hailed as the architect of victory, and his relief of Kimberley, followed by the capture of Cronjé, seemed to validate his strategy of manoeuvre and encirclement. The victory restored British military prestige at a critical moment and silenced much of the political criticism that had been directed at the government over the war's conduct. Yet Paardeberg also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern warfare. The 10-day bombardment that reduced Cronjé's position to rubble required an enormous expenditure of artillery ammunition, highlighting the logistical demands of sustained operations. The fact that even surrounded and outnumbered 4-1, the Boers had inflicted over 1,000 British casualties before surrendering showed that military success against a determined enemy would be expensive regardless of tactical approach. The presence of civilian families in the Boer laager and their suffering during the siege foreshadowed the blurring of combatant and non-combatant distinctions that would characterize the war's later phases. The artillery tactics employed at Paardeberg became a template for subsequent operations. British commanders had learned that rather than risking infantry in costly assaults, they could use overwhelming firepower to reduce enemy positions systematically. This approach would be refined throughout the remainder of the war and would influence British military doctrine for decades. The emphasis on artillery preparation before infantry assault, carried to its logical extreme in the First World War, had its roots in operations like Paardeberg, where firepower proved decisive. For the Boer fighters who surrendered at Paardeberg, the experience marked the end of their personal war, but the beginning of new hardships. Prisoner of war camps were harsh environments where disease and malnutrition took a steady toll. Many of Cronjé's men would spend the next 2 years in captivity, far from home, watching helplessly as the war they had fought continued without them. Some died in captivity, victims of disease or the psychological toll of imprisonment. Others returned home after the war to find their farms burned and their families interned in concentration camps. Piet Cronjé himself spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, first in Cape Town and later in St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon had been exiled nearly a century earlier. He was treated with respect as befitted his rank and reputation, but his capture marked the end of his military career and dimmed the glory of his Majuba victory. After the war, Cronjé toured internationally, including appearances in America where he was exhibited almost like a curiosity, the defeated Boer general. It was a humiliating coda to a military career that had included genuine achievement. The strategic significance of Paardeberg extended beyond the immediate loss of 4,000 Boer fighters. The battle demonstrated that British forces could coordinate complex operations involving multiple divisions, that their logistics could sustain armies in the field for extended campaigns, and that their artillery could reduce even well-defended positions. These were all capabilities that the Boers could not match. The republics had limited industrial capacity, no ability to replace losses in artillery or ammunition on a large scale, and a finite manpower pool. Every man captured at Paardeberg was irreplaceable, while Britain could ship reinforcements from across a global empire. The psychological break that Paardeberg represented for the Boer cause cannot be overstated. Before Paardeberg, despite setbacks and defeats, there remained a belief among many Boers that they could win the war, or at least secure terms that would preserve their independence. Paardeberg shattered that belief. The sight of Cronjé, the hero of Majuba, surrendering with his entire force, demonstrated that individual tactical brilliance and courage were insufficient against the Empire's vast resources. The war would continue, but it would continue without the optimism that had characterized the earlier phases. The battle also marked a turning point in international perception of the war. European powers that had been sympathetic to the Boer cause, viewing them as small republics standing up to imperial aggression, began to reassess their positions as British victory seemed inevitable. The fall of Paardeberg, followed by the capture of the Boer capitals, made continued resistance seem futile, and international support for the Boer cause began to wane. This diplomatic isolation would make it harder for the Boers to secure foreign intervention or even moral support as the war dragged on. When we reflect on the Battle of Paardeberg more than a century later, we see it as the hinge on which the war turned. Before Paardeberg, the outcome seemed uncertain, with British disasters balanced against limited successes and the sieges creating a sense of imperial crisis. After Paardeberg, despite 2 more years of guerrilla warfare, the ultimate outcome was no longer seriously in doubt. The British would win. The only questions were how long it would take and at what cost. The battle demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Boer military system. Their tactical skill and marksmanship remained formidable even in defeat. The casualties they inflicted on Kitchener's assault on February 18th showed that entrenched Boers were still deadly opponents. But their lack of formal military organization, the absence of a unified command structure, and Cronjé's stubborn refusal to adapt to changing circumstances all contributed to the disaster. A more flexible commander would have abandoned the wagon train and made a rapid retreat with just the fighting men, preserving the force for future operations. Cronjé's decision to stand and fight at Paardeberg, essentially allowing himself to be trapped, was a fatal error born of conventional military thinking applied to an unconventional war. For the British, Paardeberg represented the validation of Robert's strategic approach and the beginning of the end for Boer conventional resistance. The methodical siege, the overwhelming concentration of force, the intelligent use of artillery rather than infantry assaults, all of these elements would characterize successful British operations for the remainder of the war. But Paardeberg also showed that victory would require enormous resource, commitment, and patience. The 10-day siege tied down over 20,000 British troops and consumed vast quantities of ammunition to capture 4,000 Boers. Extrapolating these ratios across the entire war effort revealed the staggering scale of resources required to defeat even a small, under-equipped enemy fighting on familiar terrain. The broken Boer laager at Paardeberg, with its destroyed wagons and makeshift graves, became a symbol of the war's brutality and the futility of conventional resistance against industrial-age firepower. The families who endured the 10-day bombardment, huddled in caves along the riverbank, experienced a preview of the total war that would characterize 20th-century conflicts, where distinctions between combatants and non-combatants blurred and suffering became indiscriminate. The concentration camps that awaited these families after the surrender would extend that suffering far beyond the battlefield. The Battle of Paardeberg broke more than just a Boer commando force. It broke the illusion that courage and tactical skill alone could defeat industrial military power. It demonstrated that modern wars were won not just on battlefields, but through logistics, resource mobilization, and the willingness to commit overwhelming force for as long as necessary. The Boers at Paardeberg fought bravely and endured terrible conditions before surrendering, but their bravery could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of power that favored the British Empire. The riverbank where Cronjé made his final stand, where British artillery systematically destroyed a Boer force over 10 days of continuous bombardment, marked the end of one phase of the war and the beginning of another. The conventional war of prepared positions and large-scale battles gave way to guerrilla warfare of raids and ambushes. But the memory of Paardeberg lingered, a reminder that the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt, that the British had solved the tactical problems that had led to earlier defeats, and that the war would end in British victory, regardless of how long Boer resistance continued. The battle that broke the Boers at Paardeberg was not a single dramatic clash, but a 10-day grinding down of courage and hope under relentless bombardment and encirclement. It was industrial warfare at its most methodical and ruthless, applying overwhelming force to destroy an enemy that could not escape and would not surrender until all hope was exhausted. The lessons of Paardeberg, about firepower and logistics and the ultimate triumph of material superiority, would echo through military history for generations. But for those who experienced it, British and Boer alike, Paardeberg was simply 10 days of hell that ended with surrender, defeat, and the realization that this war, like all modern wars, would be decided not by heroism but by which side could endure the most suffering and still continue fighting.